I'm in.
What are you guys up to? I'm right here. How are you? This is League of Legends.
Good evening all, and
can you hear me
welcome.
okay?
Tonight, we have a collection of 50 cryptid stories in the rain. I'd also like to extend a special happy birthday to Charlie Riggs. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control.
What's up, Jay? How are you?
These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, Harry, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpacking trip, just the 2 of us. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up until that point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car, and seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. My boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones, machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise is to not startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on them. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound backpack makes it difficult to make conversation. We were an hour in, and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream that was to the left of our trail. Silent woods are never a good sign, as this usually indicates a predator nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we hadn't said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the time, and gave each other glances of knowing. I came over the top of the hill, and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me in the middle of the trail was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and started flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get his attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting on all fours, not looking away from us once. My husband quickly swung me around so that I was behind him and started yelling. Being in the military, he knows how to yell. The grizzly wasn't quite fazed as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. The bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, as he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. My husband said, "It's probably just some falling branches." We both knew this wasn't the case.
That's good.
At this point,
Good.
we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment, my husband stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we're not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large, dark mass, black, brownish. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly that we had seen just moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run, but that is exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. My husband was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're gonna be okay. I'm sure this won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not another hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we'd sat down, I noticed bushes moving in line towards the clearing towards us. Out of the bushes comes this adolescent grizzly, who looks just as spooked as I'm sure we did. But he came straight for us. My husband, being this crazy nut, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick and the bear ran off. All I could think of was just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened on the second night. Before we began our backpack, we had to let the ranger station know which trails and routes we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpack to check on you to make sure everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on these trails, we had been the sole hikers, and we didn't see another person once we were en route. Anyhow, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We'd been following hoofprints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my bootlace and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or 2 of daylight left, and in the woods it gets dark fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and my husband was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine for some reason wouldn't even turn on. We needed to find somewhere to set camp up, and we needed to eat. It was freezing, and the wind was blowing, creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear my husband or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be about 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being about 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked out he was until we'd left. There was no moonlight, so all the illumination we had was from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead or fallen just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing music out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sound. He also thought it would ward off any nearby predators. This is where we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was bad. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. It was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Were they falling trees? There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. There was a thud. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing, definitely, not a falling tree. There was another thud. It came from right outside our tent. We both stopped breathing. His hands found mine, and we clung to each other paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. Shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps, but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inwards. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside. So I flashed my flashlight at that side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was in the shape of a human face, pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. My husband said, "Screw that," pulled out a Glock from his sleeping bag, cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back and we heard fast footsteps heading towards the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent until the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals we had left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife is not the most dangerous thing in the backcountry.
What's up, Pocket Rocket? How are you? What are you doing?
I am from Alaska. I was born into the Togateli tribe in the center of Alaska in 1980. This is about 50 miles south of Fairbanks, in a small town called Nenana. There are several other tribes in the immediate area, and long ago there were far more before Russian and American settlement. I don't want to identify myself on accident, in case anyone from here ends up hearing this, but suffice to say that paranormal experiences are natural and expected as part of my ancestral heritage. As a child, my grandparents told my father strange stories of the stickmen, who were eaters of men. They especially loved the flesh of children, and newborn babies were considered delicacies by these spirits of the forest. One time when Nenana was first being settled by Gusok, white people, there was a hunter who came from faraway lands to settle the wilderness of Alaska and hunt its bears and moose. He took a small party of hunters and native guides into the forest, deep into the countryside to the marshes, where moose and bear frequented. Far down the Tatana they went, shooting every animal they saw: squirrel, moose, wolf, porcupine. The natives were silent. and led the men on, afraid to question their violent, wasteful ways. Until late one evening, the hunter called his party to set up camp and rest. They chose a quiet spot in a field, where they could see all around them in case wolves decided to try and sneak up, and they rolled out their blankets after dinner and went to sleep, leaving some to take turns watching for animals. The hunter had fallen asleep quickly, content on his bed of furs and blankets. He had dreams of sunny days, perfect for hunting the famed grizzly. He was awoken by the sound of cracking sticks. He found this odd, as they were in a field, but perhaps it was the men rekindling the fire. He peeked out of his tent to check on the encampment. Horror of horrors. There were pools of blood on the ground, but no corpses. He watched as a man, bundled tightly in his blankets, was lifted up by what appeared to be many small moving sticks and carried off towards the edge of the camp. The man woke up from the gentle rocking of his convoy and screamed, alerting the remaining hunters in the camp, who jumped up and reached for their guns. They were quick to draw but were confused by what to fire at, as mostly they just saw sticks on the ground moving in ways that were impossible. They decided to run, because there was nothing clear to shoot at. But as they ran together, they were chased by giant animals that appeared suddenly from the tall grass. The hunter waited until the men were being chased by all the animals, then jumped from his tent, and without looking back when he heard their screams, ran as fast as he could. A week later, he showed up in Nenana, crazed, exhausted, and on the edge of death. He related his story and then perished, for he would constantly wake up screaming if he tried to sleep, and thus could not rest. A version of this story is common in my family, though some details change with the storyteller. My father has seen the stickmen on a hunting trip, and like this apocryphal hunter, he has been crazed and terrorized by the memory ever since. It is said that though the stickmen go by different names and come to people in different shapes, and there is some regularity to their appearance. They generally come as either sticks, which blend in with trees, or the ground, until you come upon them, or they can visit you as an animal. This animal is usually described as either a large deer or a small moose, which can move incredibly quick for how awkward it seems to be hunched on its legs. They appear as pale or white animals, and though they usually do this to intimidate men and women, they are hungry beings who feast on the unwary. Seeing a stick man, one may be haunted for years or their entire life afterwards, but in some cases it is considered good luck, as if a stick man is uninterested with you. It means that you have powerful ancestors surrounding you. You can usually anticipate the arrival of a stick man, as the entire forest will go quiet around you for as long as they are in the vicinity, and sometimes they will speak to you and to each other. When this happens, they sound like a raspy whisper, mixed with the rattling of dry willow branches, a light chattering. Do not camp where the forest is silent, and do not look into the eyes of the stickmen, for they will drive you mad with fear. I have never seen these spirits personally, at least. I can't be sure. My only experience with one potentially happened outside of Carson City, Nevada. I was driving alone in a big Ford pickup truck late at night, when I noticed what originally I took to be a deer on the side of the road. This was no deer. It ran like a dog or cat, staying close to the ground in a liquid motion, whereas a deer would bounce or gallop as they ran. It also moved upwards of 30 miles an hour, and when it turned and ran down the hill, I realized it was much larger than almost any deer I'd ever seen, yet lacked antlers. Please, ask your questions if you have, and feel free to share your own experiences below. I live in rural Idaho, about 5 miles from a reservation. Growing up, we heard all sorts of stories and legends surrounding the res. I have to admit, I was a bit of a skeptic when it came to the things we heard. My best friend and I have always been drawn to the paranormal. When we were about 16, 17, we decided we'd go for drives on the res at night. The area we live in has a very tight-knit community, and our little town has just over 10,000 people. We basically have no crime, and everyone feels pretty safe, so driving around at night is no big deal. We went on our night's drive fairly often, with no experiences to note. One day, we had heard a story from someone at school about an abandoned schoolhouse on the other side of the reservation. Just past the schoolhouse, there was supposed to be a small bridge that went over a large farming canal. The story was that if you drove to the bridge and turned off your car, you could hear water babies. If you don't know what water babies are, they are a Native American folk tale. They're supposed to be sprites in the shape of babies or young infants, and hearing their cry is allegedly an omen of death, or perhaps something terrible. So anyway, we decided this was going to be our next driving destination. Neither of us had ever heard a water baby cry, so we were interested. That night after dark, we jumped in my car and started driving out there. The closer we got to the schoolhouse, the more uneasy I began to feel. We drove past the building that was supposed to be the schoolhouse and stopped on the bridge. I cut the lights and killed the engine. There was silence. There was no sound but the rushing water below the bridge. We sat there for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably no more than 4 to 5 minutes. We heard nothing but the water. We started joking about the stories being fake and decided that it was time to go home. The keys were still in the ignition, so I simply tried to start the car. Nothing. The dash lights lit up, but it just wouldn't turn over. I'd never had any problem with the car before. I tried a few more times while talking to my friend, not wanting to freak her out. About the 3rd or 4th time, I turned to her and said, "I don't want to freak you out, but the car won't start." Her eyes grew wide and she responded with, "You're kidding me, right?" I wish I had been. We sat there for a minute just staring at each other, not knowing what to do. If we called my mum, there would definitely be some arse chewing for being out on the res so late at night. So we decided to call one of our friends that had a truck. If the battery was dead, he could give us a jump. If not, he could tow us back to town, I suppose. So we called and waited, sitting in the middle of this bridge in my dead car, frustrated from the lack of experience and car troubles. We just wanted to go home. That's when I saw it. It's a well-known fact that the reservation has packs of wild dogs that roam around, killing livestock, and there have been a few instances of them attacking kids and putting them in the hospital. This was no dog. I've seen coyotes and wolves, and there was no way in hell this was either of those things. It was skeletal, like a malnutritioned animal, and walking on all fours, slow and low to the ground. It was walking along the canal towards the bridge. I smacked my friend, making her turn to look at what I was staring at. We both stared in disbelief at this creature slowly coming towards us. Instinctively, I honked the horn. At least that still worked. That's when things got really weird. This thing stood up on 2 legs, arms limp at its sides, and I legit screamed. I had never seen anything like this in my entire life. The best way I can think to describe it is it looked like Professor Lupin's werewolf form in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It was massive. It stood between 8 to 9 feet tall and was staring at us. It took a few steps forward, and my friend and I were frozen. We were trapped in a car that we couldn't start. As it slowly started walking towards us, headlights appeared in the distance. As the lights came closer, The creature dropped back to all fours and took off for the hills where I assumed it came from. Our friend pulled up to help us, and both my creeped out friend and I kept quiet about what we had just witnessed. He walked up to the car, and I rolled my window down. He suggested we push the car off the bridge to the side of the road and pop the hood. So I threw it in neutral, got to the side of the road, and my friend asked me to pop the hood and try to start the car. So I did. The damn car started right up. I don't know what caused it to not start before, but that night I had an experience I'll never forget, and I don't go out on the res anymore at night. I'd rather not see whatever it was that night again. This happened somewhere around the mid-2000s when I was in middle school. I was staying at a friend's house for the night in the backwoods of Michigan. Immediately behind my friend Jay's house were a few acres of woods that led to a lake. If you went straight back into the woods from his backyard, there was a path that went straight to the lake, which was intersected at 90 degrees by another path about halfway to it, probably a quarter of a mile from the backyard to the lake. If you went straight down the path from the backyard that turned left at the intersection, the path was a downhill grade followed by a flat portion, followed by an uphill grade, which eventually ran into a two-lane country road, one of those 55-mile-per-hour ones that goes on for miles, with not so much, but one or two houses. It was late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to set. We, being middle school boys, were running around the woods all afternoon, playing with fake weapons and stuff. Good times. Absolutely nothing leading up to this point was strange. No weird, eerie feelings, no odd, unidentified sounds, no paranoia or ghost stories prior to playing in the woods. Just two bros running around having a great time. We were basically pretending to be army guys. At one point, Jay decided to run off, saying something about flanking the enemy. He dashes off to my left. I started creeping through the woods, pretending to get bad guys as I went. I found myself standing at the intersection described earlier. Straight forward was the lake. To the left was the path that went down, then back up to the road. I was standing looking diagonally between the two paths when I hear some faint sound slightly off to my right towards the lake. What I saw made my whole body tingle in the worst possible way. About 50 feet, maybe more, maybe less, towards the lake and just behind a tree, I see this face and shoulder peeking around it. The most terrifying part was that it was probably 2 feet or more higher than you'd expect a human's head to be. Before I could probably observe the face, which was undoubtedly hairy, it snapped back from behind the tree as it realized I could see it. The color of the figure I saw was light gray, like your average cement sidewall. Because of that, I was unsure of what it was. My first few thoughts were sheer confusion and fear. Then in my frozen state, I remembered that Jay was wearing a shirt almost exactly that shade of grey. I tried whisper shouting his name, Jay, towards the now hidden figure. I called out maybe 2 or 3 times, went off about 50 feet behind me and to my left. Down the path leading towards the road, Jay emerged from the thicker trees. This was the complete opposite direction from the figure I saw, and there's no way he could have snuck around me in that short time frame. To further drive the point home, it was fall, and the ground was covered in layers of dry, dead, deciduous leaves. The crunch from the leaves was very distinct and could not be avoided. Jay had heard me call out, and from just down the slight decline, he looked up and asked what was going on. I pointed off into the trees where I had seen the figure and said in a normal voice, I saw something big over there. As soon as I finished that sentence, I mean, the very second, whatever I had seen started stomping off towards the road. parallel to the path we were on, but probably 50 to 100 feet deeper into the woods. Woods which were too thick to see anything at that distance. For some godforsaken reason, we tried to run after it. Jay and I were athletic as 6th or 7th graders could be. We played tons of sports and were quite fast. We were hauling ass down the path parallel to the beast, as fast as we could sprint, and yet it was absolutely smoking us. The road, if I remember correctly, was a solid quarter-mile from the intersection of the two paths. We had maybe just finished running down the downhill portion when this monster was already at the road, and believe it or not, we could tell where it was from the crunching leaves, and you could hear its massive footsteps clear as day while running. When we realized it was getting to the road, we also realized a car was coming. I kid you not. As soon as the crunching leaves stopped and the thing stepped out onto the road, the car slammed its brakes and pounded on the horn. Its tires screeched for a solid 3 or 4 seconds at least. When the car finally stopped, we heard the leaves start crunching on the other side of the road, and the car slammed on the gas and peeled out of there like a bat out of hell. Keep in mind, we could only hear all of this. We didn't see the car, so there was no way we could ever track down the person to ask them what they saw. But I wouldn't be surprised if their story is out on the internet somewhere. About the time they almost turned Bigfoot into roadkill. We made our way to the road, crossed to the other side, and it was mostly flat woods as far as the eye could see. Nothing but trees, no sight nor sound of the beast. We waited for a bit and then went back home. A few things to note. Was it Bigfoot for sure? I can't say. But what I do know is that it was tall, hairy, grey, and 100% bipedal. There was absolutely no mistaking the sound of it running. It's funny though, there are descriptions and videos of Bigfoot walking and moving far faster than a normal human. But I'm almost sure this thing was sprinting. The speed at which it reached the road was utterly unbelievable. It ran a quarter of a mile in probably close to 20 seconds. And trust me, I understand how absurd that sounds. When I was 13, my mum decided I would be going to military boarding school. It was located north of Mexico in a place called Durango. Durango is known because it is home to many creepy things: drug cartels, the zone of silence, ghost towns, UFO sightings, and the like. I was in that school for around 6 years, and one day a friend invited me and other students to go to his hometown to have some tacos with his dad, a well-known rancher. When we arrived to the town, we were on his house having some drinks, and eventually he decided it was time to go. We hopped into his pickup truck, and he began driving right when the sun was setting. After about half an hour, everything was dark, and he had to turn on the headlights. I was on the front seat with my friend, and we've just arrived to the place. He slowed down his car, and we could hear the nocturnal wildlife and some scratches on the car from branches and plants. The headlights allowed us to see just enough to distinguish shapes. He stopped the car right in front of a little lake, and we could see some bushes and trees around the water. A few meters in front of the right headlight, we could see what we thought was a rock. The guys started unloading the truck while they joked around. My friend and I were still in the front smoking, when all of a sudden he said, "Did you see that?" while he pointed to the rock in front of the car with the tip of the cigarette. That just moved. Since I've always wanted to see something paranormal, I remained still. We were both looking at this rock when all of a sudden, the thing turned its head to face us with, I thought, what looked like the face of Gollum. Big, round, yellow eyes, and arched back. And I turned to my friend. He grabbed his gun and quickly got out of the car and fired 2 shots into the sky. All of this while people are still unloading the truck and making a fire for the grill and such. I heard a few scream. I saw how this creature looked up to the sky, turned around, and hopped into the water. Right after that, everyone began asking, "What happened?" My friend told us that it was actually a common sight. He explained that his father and grandfather often saw the creature when they were hunting. He said that they called it Hombre Rana, or Frogman. Just a few of the guys saw the thing. We still had the tacos and everything. We were a little creeped out, but we assumed that the Frogman was probably more scared of us than we were of him. I saw many terrifying, creepy and odd things in Durango, but the Frogman takes the cake. A cool autumn morning in mid-October is where our story begins. In a small but quaint town near Clemson County, where the Tougaloo River stands. My friends and I, Elle and Jay, went up to the mountainous region to enjoy a weekend full of camping. What we planned to do, aside from lodging and camping out in a rustic cabin, was to hike the vast trails and rugged terrain, to hunt for our meals, and sleep underneath the stars. Our trip was planned in advance, and as such, all of us thought we had everything covered, every contingency prepared for. But as we would later discover, we were horrifically wrong in that assumption of ours. Our first morning in the mountains was met with a beautiful sunrise, the likes of which I doubt any of us had ever seen before. Steadily it rose to grace us, blessing all its light touched with warmth and loving radiance. Groggily I got out of bed, still exhausted from the previous night, as I was the one who drove for the last half of the trip. After waking up a little more, I got dressed and headed downstairs to meet the rest of my group, Elle and Jay. As we gathered and sat down for breakfast, we began to discuss the first thing we would do that day, laughing our asses off as we joked and prodded at one another, teasing, making jabs, in an effort to get one of us to drive about the area, so the others didn't have to. We finished packing for the day ahead of us and loaded into the car, the attempts at persuasion from earlier failing me, as I ended up driving yet again. And so began our trek into the wilderness around us. Works for me, I thought, as I drove down the winding trail. I get to see it all up front, while those two make out in the back seat. Now to each their own. I know, but I was a little bit disgruntled at them for not taking in the scenery, so I decided to sweeten the mood. Apparently swerving on a winding incline was not the best course of action, even jokingly, as my prank was soon met with a hard smack to the face. "What the hell?" Elle exclaimed. "Are you gonna be retarded the whole trip?" I chuckled. "Calm down, I was just horsing around. I mean, you two are having your fair share of fun. Isn't it right I only get to have mine?" Elle sneered and said, "Please don't do it again. You just about made me wet myself. I thought we were gonna perish. If you're gonna joke around like that, at least make sure we're not on a narrow bend like this, okay?" I sighed. "Okay, I'm sorry. My apologies, Your Highness." After a while, I chuckled again and said, "You know, if I want to be lectured, I'd stay at home and have my ear talked off by my mother." We'd finally reached our destination. The fallen leaves decorated the forest floor, crisply crunching underfoot as we made our way further into the hiking trail, walking deeper into the wooded realm that encompassed us. The trail was peaceful, filled with moments of silence and beauty, all of which was jovially brought to an end as Jay, being the country fan he is, began whistling a beloved tune. Soon we all chimed in, singing "Take Me Home, Country Roads," as none of us could resist the urge to sing to such a camp-friendly song. We continued humming various melodies, the last marking of the day's end as the sun began to set. The final tune escaped our lips as the moon began to rise, signaling the night's arrival, and with it, the subjects to its rule. The moon's full paleness and eerie light crept through the brambles and thickets of branches, its sickly touch sending chills down our backs. A cold shiver ran throughout our bodies, and Elle began to cling to Jay, obviously frightened, and said, "Bill, maybe we should get going, like, now." You see, Elle's my best friend, and in the time we've known each other, whenever either of us gets a bad feeling, we take heed and turn away from the supposed risk. Just as we started to head back in the direction of the car, a shrill cry rang out, a deafening, blood-chilling wail that snatched away whatever peace and tranquility was left in that night. We stood frozen, with fear as our shackles, anxiety and uncertainty the ball and chain. "What the hell was that?" Jay quickly asked. Elle hugged him tighter. "Did you hear that, Dill?" We began to scan the area around us, making out whatever we could in the pale moonlit night. Our ears twitching at every sound they heard, our hearts slowing to a rhythmic pump as we fixated on something in the distance. What appeared to be two glowing, whitish-yellow orbs were in a nearby tree. As quickly as we saw them, the orbs vanished, and that horrific wail resounded soon after, leaving us motionless from fear. Courage or stupidity took hold of us, and we booked it back to the car against our better judgment, as running from a predator was a bad idea due to their instinct to hunt and give chase to fleeing prey. We all came to the unified and unspoken decision that staying there with that thing was a worse idea than doing nothing. Finally, we made it. Jay and Elle got in first, and I followed suit. Again, in the driver's seat, and I started the car. As soon as the headlights flicked on, there, in the brush, just barely visible but perceivable enough to make out from its most horrific visage, stood an actual monster. There are no other words for it. Its sickly pale yellow eyes stared into our souls as we looked back with the utmost horror imaginable. Our gaze met. It knew we were terrified of it, and honestly, it took pride in such a notion. Its skin was a reddened color, like tanned hide, only slightly darker, while its face, from what little we could see, was sharp and angular. On the next tree to it lay one of its grotesque hands, just as monstrous as the rest of it, adorned with claws at the tips of its curled, elongated fingers. One leg was partially visible, and, much to our dismay, was bent and misshapen. That's when we knew, if this was a prank, it was the best damn prank ever, as no human leg is able to bend like that. Imagine how a dog's leg would be, or some other animal, with the knee bent backwards, heels resting off the ground, all the while the pads of its feet lay nestled on the forest floor, its sharp claws digging into the dirt and leaves beneath where it stood. Then it cracked what appeared to be a smile, revealing rows of sharp and gnarled teeth, or dare I say, fangs. All of this, as drawn out as it seems, happened in the span of a minute or two. Just as quickly as we saw it, though, it slithered away back into the brush. What in the ever-loving hell was that thing? I asked, fear stinging my throat, tears burning my eyes, with Elle and Jay yelling at me to drive away. I snapped back to reality, threw the car into reverse, turned around, and gunned it down the path. To hell if it was a narrow road, and on that notion we agreed. After what felt like an anxiety-ridden eternity, we finally arrived back at the cabin, and slowly made our way inside, not out of nonchalance or lack of care, but from shock and exhaustion, complete with utter disbelief. We all decided to sleep in the same room that night, huddled around one another, cold and pale as the grave. Elle was passed out from all the excitement of it all, while Jay was soon to follow from a rundown of his adrenaline high drive. But I managed to stay awake for a while longer, gripping tightly onto my hunting utensil as I sat on the edge of the bed. I tossed and turned and awoke at every sound that came from the woods, unable to get any decent sleep for what seemed to be hours upon hours, until I finally gave in to the idea of a well-rested night. Screw that. I gave a defeated sigh. I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for a drink and a bite to eat, still on edge as my heart pounded in my chest. There I sat in the kitchen, eating my midnight snack, drinking away whatever that thing was from my memory. All of a sudden, as if on some dreadful cue, a chill runs down my back. It's the same chill I felt right before that creature showed up. A feeling of a lurking nearby danger, one that heralds the tendency for someone to proceed with an air of caution. A light tapping sounded at the window, and without thinking, I turned to look. In the darkness, two whitish, yellow eyes shone from outside, beaming into the cabin as whatever they belonged to searched around. Then, they rose higher into the air, resting almost above the window frame. Whatever this thing was, it was tall, frightfully so. It put its hand on the window, but in the moonlight, it looked wet and redder than it did before. A fresh, vicious substance dripping from its claws. Slowly I backed away, and it did the same, but neared closer and closer to the door as it stepped from the window. Seeing the door was unlocked, I bolted for it and slammed up against it as it creaked, knocking whatever that hideous thing was away, and locking the door. I heard a slight grunt and what sounded like a growl before it spoke.
Kicking butt right now,
"Let me
dog.
in, Bill," Elle said from behind the door, her voice deepening and becoming more sinister in tone. "There's a monster out here.
Let me buy that.
Please don't let him get me." I stood there, weapon in hand, tears welling in my eyes, a gasp in my throat, and then it spoke again. But this time it wasn't in Elle's voice. Jay spoke, sinisterly and maliciously, taunting us to open the door. "Let me in, little boy, let me in." It slammed against the door and let out this horrific wail. Then, an ungodly scream. Jay and Elle ran downstairs, looking as shocked and horrified as I felt. "Let me in," it demanded again. "Jay, open the door, please. It's not me in there with you." Jay became as white as a ghost, and then Elle fell to the ground, passed out from fear and disbelief. "Dylan, Dylan, Dylan." They began to laugh and then spoke in my voice. "If everyone else is having fun, isn't it only fair that I get my fair share too?" I blacked out after that. Morning came, the sun creeping over the horizons, slowly gracing us again. This sunrise was similar to the previous morning, and we finally understood why it had risen so slowly. It wasn't a gradual, majestic sunlight. It was quite the opposite. Disturbed, scared, reluctant to mantle the throne in the heavens above us. We finally understood, and after packing up, we got the hell out of there and never returned. The mountains grew distant and soon faded as I drove back home, although admittedly, I didn't mind being the driver this time. L&J refused to return there to the sprawling mountains, forested Providence of Clemson County. But one day, I will. I love the woods and mountains. Nature itself is too much to be deterred by whatever evil lurks within the darkness there. I just pray that when I do venture back to the Clemson County retreat, all goes well for me, and that I return alive and sane. Here's to hoping. For years I've been reading about skinwalkers, and only recently have I had a personal experience. I live in a suburban neighborhood that often has possums, ferals, and the like. I've never feared them. I was in my backyard one night, being melodramatic and burning some photographs, which had made me incredibly sad and negative. During that time, I felt an intense presence. I felt like I was being watched, and heard occasional leaves being crushed. I got freaked out and went inside. I fell asleep on my couch, and after a few moments from falling asleep, I heard a loud banging on my back door. I woke up my roommate and told him about it, asking to check it out with his gun. When we looked outside, we saw a cat sitting on the steps staring at us that eerily resembled the cat that we'd been feeding for years now. Except it was so wrong. Its markings were incredibly off. Its eyes were human-like, and we both felt chills immediately after seeing it. I've read that in order to replicate a being's appearance, the skinwalker has to kill that being. But after, I did see our usual stray with her usual markings. This was incredibly eerie. I used to live on a farm when I was 9 years old. In fact, it was an old schoolhouse that was about 10 kilometers away from our neighbors, with lots of trees across the country and over half an hour from town. Being a kid on a farm with lots of room, I was always exploring the bush or being out with horses and cows. We had chickens, pigeons, rabbit, peafowl, pigs, pheasants, turkeys, geese, and many other birds. I was on my way to go find the horse this day. I was always with Tony, our lead horse. She was a white horse with a black mane and tail. She was more of a foster mother to me, and I could do things with her that would just be amazing. Tony and I had a very close bond. I would climb up her tail and nap on her back as she just grazed. I would climb up her neck, since she was a tall horse for a 9-year-old, even cling and run just around her legs. I would hide under her when I was near her and it started to rain, just as a foal would do. We used to play tag, hide and seek, and so many other games. She loved playing. This is why I was on my way to see her this day. I wanted to be with my best friend. Before you say little kids should not be outside without supervision, this was very common for me, since I even slept outside with the animals that I loved and helped care for. I was raised, if you are quiet, you will see things you'll normally miss. I always remained quiet to see the wildlife. I can't remember where our German Shepherd was, but it wasn't with me on this particular trip. When I started my trip, I knew I was probably in for a long walk, since she was likely on the other side of the property and across the lake. I crossed the pasture closest to the house, finding nests, interesting rocks, crossing the pasture to the tree line, and it took me about 15 minutes, listening to what kind of birds had what kind of song, and what kind of animal may have crossed through. You can always find out what kind of things are going on around you if you pay attention. As I entered the tree line, things went quiet, so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. I didn't think much of this since I probably disturbed the wildlife. No birds sang or put up a fuss as I got closer to them. There was no breeze, and the air was very still. It felt thick, and since I was 9 years old, I just thought it was the morning dew evaporating. Most of the trees in this bush were maple or fir. I knew there was a hawk nest nearby, as well as a fox den in a ditch about 10 steps to the right. We had become aware of this problem, as some of these foxes had taken some of our chickens, but I was never mad since our hens always had babies each spring. I understood that even they had to eat, and they would only come to human areas if there was no other food source. Things were silent, not a bird or fox bark. I checked on the Robinson's nest to see if they were all right. As I peeked into the nest, the babies were awake but very silent and didn't move nor blink their eyes. I moved back onto the cow trail and got the feeling that something wasn't right. No birds, no animals, not even a sound of my footfalls on the path. I moved very slowly towards the meadow that was about 500 meters from where the tree line started. It was very slow and very quiet. Halfway through the bush, I smelt it. Rotting flesh mixed with scum, and a really bad smell of death. It's amazing how fast your senses will get used to a smell and you go noseblind. I looked around and didn't see anything, no movement, so I kept going, hoping to get through the smell. As I got to the exit of the trees, there is a meadow that always have deer, but this day I got more than I bargained for. I heard grunting and growling mixed with really rough voices, and someone had a really bad sore throat. I couldn't make out the words as I was still too far to understand. I stopped to listen as I could hear snarling, growling of some kind of big animal. It didn't sound like a bear or even a moose grunting. I laid down on the ground thinking I could sneak up and see what kind of animal was making this sound. I peeked through the trees and into the meadow, and I saw something, but I didn't know what it was. I saw 3 creatures that almost looked like really big deer, with their flesh rotting off in batches. I could see ribs and bones, as if the flesh was missing. Other parts were like brown hair mixed with a really bad case of mange. The big one had large antlers with many points. There was skin or something that was shedding off the antlers, and waved or fell off in pieces as it moved. Long ears like a donkey's. The side of its face had no skin at all, and was bare, yellowish bone. It was standing on its hind quarters, as if it were a human with a bit of a hunch. This one was doing the most grunting and growling. It was watching the 2 smaller ones and randomly pointed with its hands. It had hands, with long claws like talons. The hair this one had on its body was black. The skin was dark brown. This one was circling the other 2 slowly. I was expecting this one to join in the attacks. The hind legs were that of a big dog, but had hooves. I was not close enough to see the eyes, but I didn't want to approach it anymore. The smaller, darker one had a smaller set of antlers like a young deer, 8 points at least, but this one was a lot meaner to the smaller of the 3. Its body was lean, and it was quick. It moved in flashes, and when it paused, it took swipes and bites at the smallest. It was trying to use its hands with long claws and teeth, trying to attack the smaller brown one. I saw chunks of flesh being ripped off the smallest one who couldn't fight back, as well as the other 2. Its hands and claws were dripping with blood, and flesh hung from its claws in chunks. The smallest of the 3 was brown with 3 point antlers, only one. Its flesh was bleeding profusely from its wounds. It snarled and bared its teeth while trying to fend off the attacks. There were broken bones, hanging out the flesh. The blood was so bright against its hair and skin. I could see it dripping from where the missing antler was ripped out or broken in the fight. This was not upright like the other 2. This one was on all 4s, low to the ground, and having trouble trying to get a powerful kick into the attacker or a swipe. I saw that its right hind leg had most of the flesh ripped off already and the leg broken. There was bone on the lower leg sticking out and bending awkwardly. There wasn't much time before I knew this was a losing battle. I must have gasped at the sight when the big brown one perked its ears and turned to me. Its eyes narrowed when its gaze focused. The eyes were bright yellow, as if there was a light behind it, almost fluorescent. It didn't take its eye off me when it said in a really rough voice, "Leave. Go." I thought it was talking to me, but I was frozen in fear. I saw the two big ones run off into the trees and vanish, leaving the third behind. I was not going to approach. I was too scared to run. But just as I was about to move, I saw the small one lift its head and look at me. It growled and snarled and slowly moved to where I was. I froze. I couldn't even move. I even held my breath. I saw this creature moving for me and I couldn't move. I could see its breath now, and instead of white steam, it was pink from all the blood. Hearing a horse calling out, I looked to my right and saw our horses running towards me. My horse, with her head down in attack mode. Her nostrils flared, and she was almost screaming out. Everything went silent for a moment. Her calls were so loud they echoed in my head. I wasn't sure if my life was going to be ended by my beloved horse, or this creature heading for me out in the open. I felt doom and danger and fear. I dropped flat to the ground and called out for our horse with the herd in tow. I've never seen them run so fast. The sound of their hooves pounding the ground, which sounded hollow at this point. I saw our horses herd, about 8 horses in all, heading straight for the thing. They attacked it. The first one to reach the creature reared up, and the others surrounded it in a half circle, almost blocking my view. But I could see between the consistent moving legs the creature stand up, snarl, and snap at them. I turned my head to the lead horse, Tony, and she came running with her head down and slowed to stand next to me, gently comforting me. I stared where I was as I saw the horse herd drive it away. They stayed on attack until the things were out of sight. I hugged Tony's leg as I couldn't stand from fear. I saw her lift her head to call the herd. I was shaking so badly and breathing heavily. I thanked her for saving my life. She let me take my time to calm down, and I didn't let go of her. When I was able to stand, she guided me home, as I'd seen the other horses putting up a fuss, bucking and prancing, tossing their heads around as they ran back to their leader. I was scared of what was in the woods. It wasn't until I was home to ask my mum what the creature was that I'd seen. I described it to her as much as possible, and I was told deer or elk, and not to talk of it again. The next day after school, I went out to the same meadow. I'm a sucker for punishment, I know. I had to see for myself what really had happened, and I saw the blood-stained grass and dirt from where the fight had taken place. Fast forward to adulthood. I'm watching movies and hearing stories on YouTube, and that's when it clicks. I realized what I had seen and what could have happened to me when I was 9 years old if the horses hadn't saved my life. It's still creepy to recall this, knowing that these creatures were less than 5 kilometers from our home. I'm a big outdoorsman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So of course, when I decided to go to college, I had to keep in mind that having some decent woods nearby was a must. Upon checking a couple of places out, I decided to go to Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania, or just the borough. The biggest plus about going to that university is that my Uncle Fred lived up there and was a well-known name in the community. He owns to this day a framing shop right in the middle of the small town area. This was a huge plus, since knowing people like that always equals more land to put spots in. That's all I really needed to pick the college I would be going to. Edinburgh is really cool because there are lots of old buildings and strange, flat landscapes as compared to the hilly land around Pittsburgh. So it was cool to figure out how to scout the game that I'd be going after once the season started. My main hunting area was directly behind my uncle's house. He has a beautiful log cabin that sits back off the road with woods on all sides of it. It was truly a thing of beauty. When he had the house built, he actually had the gigantic chimney made of flat stones that we found in the woods behind the house. As I was scouting the area for the first time, I came up on a few different circles of boulders in the middle of the woods. They were definitely very old. The boulders were quite big, much too big just to be moved there for some reason, like a group of guys came camping out. They must have taken at least 10 men to move, and only if they'd have had some kind of pulley system or something. There were also smaller rocks, and when I say smaller, I'm talking like somewhere around 300 pounds or more, making inner circles inside of the large boulders. I found a total of 7 of these stands throughout the property. Some of the rocks that were now part of the chimney, they simply had to be with the amount of rocks he used on them. Oh, and also these rock circles had made a much larger circle around the woods. After a few more days of scouting with my buddy Brandon, we were sure we had our spot picked out for our first day of archery. We couldn't wait to get out there. Perfect day too. It was great. The thing about Edinburgh is that it gets more snow per year than most of Alaska, due to the lake effect snow coming across Lake Erie. What happens is before the lake freezes completely over, the water, which is warmer than the air, pushes the clouds way up high into the atmosphere, too high for them to actually snow due to the low temperature all the way up there. The clouds then come inland and fall back towards Earth. It takes them about 20 miles to do this, and Edinburgh is about 20 miles from the lake. You see what I'm saying. Anyway, on the first day of archery, which is in the first week of October in Pennsylvania, there was a thin layer of snow. This is perfect for archery, because you can see deer in the woods much more easily, and you can also see if any animal has left any tracks. If they did, they were fresh, since the snow didn't happen too long before that. In our trees for about 2 hours or so, neither of us had seen anything. I had just gotten off the radio with Brandon, who was on the other side of the property, when I see some movement over to my right of the pine thicket. I then see a branch move a little bit, and see 4 deer legs underneath. I readied my bow and my stance, as to make a good clean shot at the deer. Around 15 feet up in a tree, I did this very carefully. About a minute later, as I was looking for any movement, I lost the 4 legs inside the thicket. This was expected due to the fact that where the deer would have been is a common feeding area for them. So I waited. Maybe another minute or so later, I caught movement again. It looked as if the deer would break through the thicket into more open woods. The movement I've been waiting for. As I brought the bow up into a full drawn stance, I was stunned by what I was seeing. Where the deer should have been, there was a man. A strange man at that. This absolutely should not have been. If there was a man anywhere near where that deer had been, the deer would have been long gone, spooked back into the thicket. I put my bow back down onto the hook that I screwed into the tree, and lifted my binoculars to my eyes. At only 35 yards away, I could now see in great detail his physical appearance. He was rather rotund, with his belly leading the way. A white, long-sleeved shirt, on with ruffles down the middle, just like the pirate shirt in that one episode of Seinfeld, if any of you have indulged. It was tucked into thick canvas brown pants, with pants being tucked into white socks directly below his knees. Further down where his shoes should be, there was absolutely nothing. He had no feet whatsoever, no calves, no shins, no shoes. And with my eyes wide open, I mouthed to myself, "What the hell?" Instead of walking, he seemed to float through the woods, going from right to left. This is when I started noticing other extremely strange things about him. I looked through the binoculars at his head. It was cocked back with his chin resting down on his lower neck. His very large, red, bulbous nose up in the air, a bit of a snobby overall look. The hair, though, it was covered by a wig that judges in England wear. A white wig with 3 curls on the side of it, where his ears would have been. I noticed that he didn't seem to float through the woods. He was floating through the woods. His arms stayed tucked at his sides, unmoving as he traveled. He also never looked down. The way his head was cocked, he could have only been looking upwards. This is not any person or animal, as they'd be constantly looking down and around for obstacles that you might trip over. All of this happened within a period of about 20 seconds. He had come out of the thicket behind a medium-sized oak tree. Then, when he hit the next oak, he never came out from behind it. I watched in absolute astonishment for another 5 seconds, waiting for him to break his cover, so that I could see him again. This never happened. I told Brandon what had just happened, and was immediately made fun of. I expected that was what would be coming through the radio after I got done talking. He was just saying I should have taken a picture of the only deer/human or minotaur remaining in the world. I told him he won't be laughing when the deer-tour came over to his tree stand and smacked his ass right out of it. Even though it was in the middle of the hunt, I had to get down and see what the hell just happened. I knew where he would have walked. Not only would I see his footprints in the snow, but it would have also been very easy to see even better tracks due to the fact the area we were in was full of muddy ground. A freaking hummingbird would have left tracks in this muddy mess. As you probably guessed, when I go over to the spot where he had been, there was nothing. I saw not a single track from him, nor deer, nor anything. I was utterly amazed. What happened later that night was just as creepy. So after I was done checking out the muddy snow ground where the man should have left some kind of footprint, I went back to my tree stand and climbed back up to the height that I'd been hunting from earlier. I radioed Brandon and told him I was back up the tree and secure. We always did this as a precaution, in case something happened while we were climbing the tree, or securing the platform of the portable tree stand. My old man's buddy, Bunky, actually saved his left eye from being completely blind and useless. He was practicing shooting from a raised platform when he slipped and fell off, driving a stick right into his eyeball as he hit the ground. This has nothing to do with the story, but all of you hunters out there should adopt this practice. You know, the more you know. Anyway, we're hunting the rest of the day, but not without periodic raging from Brandon, making fun of me and the deer-tour throughout the rest of the hunt. I knew I'd be hearing about it for at least a week or longer. That is, of course, if the rest of the night would have been a normal one, which, as it turns out, it was not. As twilight approached, I radioed Brandon and told him I was going to start getting out of the tree. Brandon was actually in a built stand that we found while scouting in the months prior. So I had him meet me at my spot, due to the fact it was going to take me much longer to get my stand down and off the tree. Just as I thought, Brandon was walking up to my spot, right as I was getting to the bottom of the tree. Once I got all the way to the bottom, I unhooked the straps that were around my feet, jumped down to the ground, and started feverishly explaining to him everything that happened. I took him over to the muddy area to show him that there were absolutely no tracks in the snow or mud. I definitely could sense he didn't completely believe everything I was telling him. I was able to sense this so easily because he looked right at me with his mouth agape and his eyebrows pushing up towards the middle of his forehead and said, "Are you messing with me, brother?" He was also able to tell that I wasn't messing with him when I looked at him in what I'm sure are some of the craziest eyes he's ever seen and said, "Hell no." When he realized I was 100% serious, he started taking inventory of all the things that I had previously told him, and we went back and forth trying to make any kind of sense of what I had witnessed. While we were talking to each other back and forth, we had failed to notice that nighttime was already upon us. It was that Stephen King full dark.
During a snowstorm in 1982, a man on board a commercial plane looked out of his window and saw something very strange at the top of a Colorado mountain. When authorities were alerted and sent to that spot on the mountain, they could not believe what they found there. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to participate in your nice casual the like button to participate in your very fun, very casual neighborhood squirt gun fight, but then squirt the like button with sulfuric acid. Squirt the like button with sulfuric acid, not water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2018, a 56-year-old father of four named Tayeb Suyami was living in a quiet, modest town in New Jersey called Little Ferry. Tayeb had moved to the United States from Africa back in 1996, and after getting settled in New Jersey, he had landed a job as an accountant for a food importing company. At first, Tayeb's salary had been enough to provide for the family, but as his family grew, his salary just wasn't enough, and money became a real problem. And so eventually, Tayeb's wife also got a full-time job, but even then, with two full-time working adults, the family had to stay on a very strict budget just to make ends meet. And that year, in 2018, one of Tayeb's daughters was getting ready to go to college, and so Tayeb was forced to refinance his mortgage just to make the initial payments on his child's college bills. But despite his financial struggles, Tayeb did not let it bother him. He was an eternal optimist who fundamentally believed that in the end, everything would just work itself out. On May 1st of that year, Tayeb was on his way home from work when his wife called him and asked if he would swing by the grocery store and pick up some orange juice. So Tayeb stopped at the ShopRite grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was only a couple miles north of Little Ferry where they lived. And he went inside, he went to the juice aisle, and he scanned the different brands of orange juice, and at some point he grabbed the most appealing orange juice that was still within their budget. It was $5. He takes the juice, he goes to the front of the store, he pays for it, he goes outside, he hops in his car, and he heads home. When he pulls into his driveway, he gets out, he goes into the house, he goes right into the kitchen where his wife was, and he proudly set the orange juice down on the kitchen table, expecting a thank you from his wife. But his wife turned around and she looked at the orange juice and she saw the brand he had purchased, and she immediately said, "How much did you pay for that?" And Tayeb said, $5. And she said, "Well, you got to take it back because I know that brand is on sale for $2.50 at the grocery store right down the road. So go return this one." And so Tayeb was totally annoyed because he just got home from work. He thought he had done a good deed and now he's in trouble. And so he decided, you know what, I'm not going to fight her on this. He just walked over, grabbed the $5 orange juice, and he went back outside, hopped in his car, and took off. A few minutes later, he arrived at the Hackensack, New Jersey ShopRite. He went inside and he went straight to the customer service desk where there was a teenager behind the counter. And Tayeb walked over to them and he handed them the juice along with his receipt and he asked for a refund. And so while Tayeb is standing there letting this cashier complete the transaction, he looked behind the cashier at the wall and there was this sign that totally piqued his interest. And so he's staring at the sign, and then finally the teenage cashier, he finishes the transaction, and he reaches out across the counter with Tayeb's $5. And Tayeb, he reaches out and he takes the $5, but then he pauses for a second. And he's kind of looking up at the sign, and he's thinking about what he should do. And he knows that if he does this, if he does what the sign is telling him to do, he's going to get in trouble with his wife, because this is the exact opposite of what he was sent out to do. But Tayeb just couldn't help it, and he takes the $5 and he proceeds to hand it right back to the cashier, and he tells the cashier what he wants him to do with it. And so a couple minutes later, Tayeb leaves the ShopRite with no juice, with no $5, but 2 small slips of paper in his back pocket. And so Tayeb hops in his car and he drives to the grocery store that's right down the road from their house. He goes inside and he gets the on sale $2.50 bottle of orange juice. And then he goes back into his car, he drives home, he goes in the kitchen and he sets the juice on the counter and tells his wife, yep, I got the right one, $2.50. And he's just hoping the whole time that she has not checked the bank account and has not discovered what he had really been doing while he was out, because he had actually spent more money on the second trip than the first time. But apparently his wife had not checked the account yet, and she just thanked him for being willing to go out and get the better deal. And so Tayeb very happily left the kitchen, and he spent the rest of the night watching TV and hanging out with his family. And then early the next morning, Tayeb got up and he decided, you know what? I need to do something to curry some favor with my wife, because she's gonna learn what I did with the refund money pretty soon. And so he decided he would just go out and do a bunch of yard work that day, right in front of his wife, to make sure she really saw that he was doing some good stuff. And so he goes outside, he opens up the garage, and he's about to pull the lawnmower out when he notices his car is really dirty. And so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go wash my car first and then come back and cut the grass and do some other things. And so he goes inside and he tells his wife what his plan is, and she says, okay, I'll see you in a little bit when you come back from the car wash. And then Tayeb went back outside, he hopped in his car, and he left. As he was driving to the car wash, he made a pit stop at a small store that was set back off the road. And so he goes inside and he goes right to the back of this little store where there's this strange machine that looks like an ATM, and it has a screen on it with text scrolling across it. And at the bottom, there was an opening where a barcode scanner was kind of projecting down. And so Tayeb walks up to this machine and he reaches into his back pocket and he pulls out those 2 slips of paper he had got from the grocery store cashier the night before, and he puts the first one under the scanner, and then he reads the text that appears on the screen of this machine. And after reading it, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and puts that piece of paper back in his pocket. And then the second slip of paper he puts into the scanner, and then when he reads the words that pop up on the screen, he thinks there's been a mistake, because all it says is "see receptionist." And so he rescans the second slip of paper to see if something different will happen, but sure enough, again, it just says "see receptionist." And so he pulls the second slip of paper out of the scanner, he turns around and he walks to the front of the store and he hands the paper to the woman behind the counter. Over an hour later, Tayeb pulled into his driveway and he sat in his driveway for a second. He was still shaking from what had just happened inside of that small store. So he gets out of his car, which was still totally dirty, and he made his way into the house and he went straight to the kitchen where his wife was. And so as soon as he gets in the kitchen, his wife turns around and looks at him and says, "Where were you? The car wash is like 5 minutes away. Why were you gone for like 2 hours?" But Tayeb, he's got no expression on his face, and he looks at his wife and just says, "Give me $100. And his wife scrunches her face up at him and says, "No, where's your money?" And Tayeb smiles, he turns around, he reaches into his back pocket, and he pulls out that second slip of paper, and he hands it to his wife, and he says, "Here's my money." After getting that $5 refund at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey, Tayeb noticed a sign on the back wall that was advertising for a Moneyball jackpot lottery. And he had decided to use the $5 refund to buy 2 lottery tickets. And so he buys these 2 lottery tickets, and the next day, that store set back off the road he went to was a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, and the machine he was using was a machine that scanned your lottery tickets to see if they were winners. And so the first ticket he scanned, it was a dud, it didn't win anything. But the second ticket, when he scanned it, it couldn't process the amount of money he had just won. And so that's why I told him to see the receptionist. And so he brought the second ticket up to the counter, he handed it to the woman, and after she scanned it and saw the amount of money he had won, all she could do was say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And when he asked her, "What are you looking at? What happened?" She just goes, "Big." And so when he got home, Tayyab handed that slip to his wife, and on it was the amount of money that he had won. He was the jackpot winner. He had won $315 million. Tayyab would say that he and his wife and his kids all laughed and cried and celebrated in the kitchen all night. And within a couple of days, Tayyab had left his job, he retired, and he had paid off all of his family's debts. And at his press conference for the New Jersey lottery, he was quoted as saying, "I love orange juice now." In 2012, someone went on Reddit and asked people to share their personal glitch in the Matrix stories. A glitch in the Matrix story is any story where something totally unusual happens that doesn't have a logical explanation. So these are true stories, or at least purported to be true. They're first-hand accounts, and they're very popular on Reddit. And so this particular query on Reddit got very popular. It went totally viral, and so there were thousands and thousands of stories commented down below. So lots of people gave their glitch in the Matrix story. Now, the top comments, so the top stories that were given, were really, really interesting. But by far, the best response, the best glitch in the Matrix story, got no attention at all. It was buried at the bottom of 14,000 plus comments. This story, which was written by a person who just went by Sarah X11, should have gone completely viral. It should have been the top comment by far. But for whatever reason, it wasn't. And so now, 10 years later, no one really knows about it. While we don't know for sure if Sarah X11's story is true, as it is just an unverified first-hand account, what we do know is that this was the first story that Sarah X11 had ever posted to Reddit about glitches in the Matrix. The majority of her Reddit activity consisted of liking cute pictures of cats and dogs. So this person, this user, was not on Reddit for clout. Also, when Sarah X11 posted her story in this Reddit thread, there were already thousands and thousands of comments posted. So if they were trying to get recognized through this story, they chose the worst post to do it on. If you want to get recognized in a comment section and be a top comment, typically you have to be one of the very first comments after this thing gets posted. And so she's posting after thousands and thousands of people have done this. So in my mind, it seems like this post by Sarah X11, this story, has got to be true. And even if it isn't true, it's one of the coolest stories I've come across on the internet that is guaranteed to give you goosebumps. Okay, here we go. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about. Or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in, Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds. So it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the two cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you," and then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours, and then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year-long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name, because Aurora had given her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life. On the evening of January 6th, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is an area just west of Denver, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. After running into the terminal and getting checked in and getting through security, he made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. Feeling very relieved, Harold joined the queue of other people that were getting on the ramp to go down into the plane, and then just a couple of minutes later, he stepped on board and he found his seat, which was located at the front right side of the plane. He sat down in his seat, he buckled in, and then he grabbed an in-flight magazine from the back pocket of the chair in front of him, and he waited for takeoff. 15 minutes later, as the plane was rumbling down the runway at full speed, Harold looked out the window. So as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away as they got higher and higher up. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, Harold noticed something very odd out of his window. Located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. Now, this was a beautiful scenic drive that Harold was very familiar with, but this road was not maintained in the wintertime. So if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. Yet, as Harold looked out of his plane window down to Jefferson County below, and he kind of scanned his way west up into the Rockies, he saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. And so Harold's thinking to himself, why in the world would anyone be on the Guanella Pass in the middle of this huge snowstorm? It didn't make any sense. But as Harold watched this vehicle, he saw what was going on. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. This motorist was trapped. Harold knew the likelihood of another plane happening to fly over this area and looking down and seeing those lights and recognizing them for what they were, an emergency, were slim to none. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And so Harold quickly got up from his seat, he climbed over the person next to him, he got into the aisle, he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. And so the attendant took him very seriously. They turned around, they went into the cockpit, and they told the pilots, and the pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground. And then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, who was driving in a four-wheel drive SUV, arrived at the start of this 22-mile stretch of Mountain Pass, and as they're driving through the whipping snow, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle. And so he drives right up alongside this vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And so Dave, he parks his SUV, he hops out, and he rushes over to the driver's side window of this vehicle. And inside was a terrified-looking 30-year-old man named Alan Phillips, who was a mechanic who lived in the Denver area. Now, at the time, it was the middle of the night, it's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the winds are whipping, the snow is coming down, and Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. So had Harold not spotted his flashlight SOS signal from the plane, it's almost guaranteed that Alan would have died that night from hypothermia. And so when Alan turned and saw Dave standing there, his rescuer, Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. When Dave asked Alan what happened, Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar, and then when it was time to come home, he had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home, forgetting that this particular stretch of road was not maintained during the winter. When Dave asked Alan how he got this really deep bruise on his cheek, he assumed he got it from crashing off the side of the road, Alan smiled a kind of embarrassed smile and said, "No, actually, after I got stuck, I needed to urinate, and so I got out of the vehicle and I walked a few paces away from my truck and I went to the bathroom, and then when I turned to walk back, the snow was so blinding I couldn't actually see my truck, and I ran to go find it again because I didn't want to be trapped out in the snow, and I ran into the truck face first, and so my cheek hit the door of the truck." And so Dave, he just smiled and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. However, as it would turn out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. The truth was, earlier in the evening that Alan would eventually get stuck, he had murdered 2 hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the Guanella Pass. Both of these murders had gone cold, but in late 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. Several hours before Alan got rescued, he picked up 22-year-old Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking, and after she got into his truck, it's believed he held her at gunpoint and then put zip-tie handcuffs on her wrists, and then we don't really know what happened next, but at some point that night, Annette was taken out of the vehicle and led into the woods, and she was shot in the back, and she was left face down in a stream. A couple of hours after he killed Annette, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, and when she got into his truck, it's believed he did the same thing. He held her at gunpoint and put her in zip-tie handcuffs. However, Barbara was able to break out of her restraints. It's believed she struck Alan in the cheek, which is why he got that deep bruise on his cheek, and then she leapt out of his car and started running. But Alan got out, chased her down, and shot her in the chest, killing her, and then he dumped her body off the side of this cliff down into the snowbank below. So the only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders, and he likely just didn't understand how dangerous this pass was, and so shortly after turning onto it, his truck slid off the road and he got stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these 2 murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Assuming he did it, that Alan killed these 2 women, we don't know what his motivations were. It's not clear, he hasn't said, and we also don't know if there are potentially other victims. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to participate in your very fun, casual neighborhood squirt gun fight, but then squirt the like button with sulfuric acid, not water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we put out brand new, never before heard stories every Monday morning. We also put out remastered audio from our most popular YouTube videos on Thursday morning. So again, the name of the podcast is just Mr. Ballin Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, basically anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is just @MrBallin, and then just send me a direct message. I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is just called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and the other channel is called Mr. Ballin en Español, and it is a Spanish language channel. We have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin that puts out near daily content, and we also have a Snapchat channel, also just called Mr. Ballin, that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called Mr. Ballin, and it's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
My Aunt Rachel practically raised me. After a lengthy battle with terminal illness, she passed last year, leaving what little she had left after the hospital bills were paid. I was to take care of a cockatiel parrot, tugboat, and a collection of 50s cartoon-themed collective plates. Basically, the only two items that couldn't be easily sold at an auction. If you saw the plates, you'd see why. Downright creepy things. One, in particular, a plate portraying a young cartoon girl feeding apples to a giant frog. It's like the whole thing was made by two different people. The girl looked positively Disney, while the frog was more, I don't know, uncomfortably unrealistic. It was such an odd item that there had to be a collector looking for it somewhere. I was sure of it. Yet for weeks, I couldn't find anyone even remotely interested. I posted pictures of the plate on pretty much every social media account I had, along with a few auction sales, but there were no takers. There were no markings or stamps indicating year or brand, unlike the other plates, and I was starting to think it was custom made. I couldn't stand looking at it, so I put it in a box in the garage. The others went up on my kitchen wall. My aunt would have wanted it that way. I live in a house not too far from the lake, on the outskirts of a small Minnesota town. There are a few houses in the nearby area, but I couldn't even hit the closest neighbor's yard with a rock if I tried. There's only a single streetlight that works outside, and that thing is flimsier than our summer weather. I rarely have any visitors, as this place can be a bit too out of the way, even for my friends to come by. I inherited this place from my mom, who passed away when I was younger. I'm one of the lucky house owners of my generation, but at what cost? My aunt's bird, tugboat, fit right in. It was easy for me to fix him in a big cage in one of the back rooms. When you're living on your own in a place like this, you got more space than you know what to do with. My aunt's funeral was simple. She'd insisted she paid for it herself, so it had to be as basic and cheap as can be. She hated the thought of ever being a burden, and she practically begged me to take care of Tugboat. You don't say no to that. You just don't. Besides, that bird was damn near the only thing that kept me sane through the COVID pandemic. Having lived in an empty house, you learn to identify most sounds around the property. The hum of the fuse box, the buzzing kitchen lights, the noise from the fridge against the backdrop of a TV that's been way too long without anyone watching. This was the only reason I ever really took notice that one night when this all started. I was turning on my electric toothbrush one night, only to notice it was completely silent. The motor was running. I felt the vibrations. I saw it spin. But there were no sounds. Not a peep. Yet, I could still hear the TV in the other room just fine. Over the next few days, there were several of these odd instances. Once the egg timer went off, but didn't make a sound, causing me to overboil my breakfast. I thought the ventilation was broken once, but it turned out to have just gone quiet. Hell, at one point, I dropped one of my aunt's collective plates. It shattered against the ceramic tiles, yet didn't make any noise. I was starting to think I was going deaf, but the 2 doctors I spoke to confirmed my hearing was just fine. Still, the mental image of seeing that falling plate and expecting a loud crash, only for it to remain silent. There was something eerie to it. A friend of mine, Patrick, works for the sheriff's department. We usually had lunch once a week to catch up, but that tradition teetered off during the pandemic. This time, I met him at the supermarket, but barely even noticed him. I had been having trouble sleeping and getting to work on time, as my alarm clock sometimes stayed silent for no apparent reason. My boss wasn't too happy, so I had to start using a vibration alarm. Patrick elbow bumped me in the fruit aisle, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Hey there," he said, grabbing a handful of oranges. "You doing okay?" "Yeah, sorry. I didn't see you there." "These are crazy times," he said. "I heard about Rachel. I'm sorry I couldn't make the funeral." "That's okay," I nodded. "She never was much for men in uniform." Patrick laughed. We went our separate ways and finished our shopping, only to meet in the parking lot outside. We'd managed to park next to each other without even realizing it. He leaned against the hood of his car. Hey, have you seen any strangers around? After this year, you all seem like strangers. You know what I mean, he chuckled. Strangers, passerbys. No, sorry, I don't get out much. Some of your neighbors have had problems, you know. Be careful. Problems? He looked at me like a deer in headlights. You don't know? Apparently, there had been reports of a theft. First, they thought it was raccoons, but someone had gone through the trash cans. But raccoons don't try to pick locks. They also don't leave food behind, or human-sized handprints on the windows. Some people have reported seeing a woman with tangled hair roam about, but the police hadn't managed to find her. This is what made me start looking more closely at my own property. I had noticed the garbage can lid gone missing, but I hadn't given it much thought. Also, I could have sworn there were handprints on my car one dewy morning. I tried to tell myself that it was all paranoia, but after what Patrick said, it seemed that everything was a clue, or a warning. In my mind, the strange woman was lurking behind every corner. I tried to put it out of my mind. One night, as I heard Tugboat sing his interpretation of Earth, Wind and Fire September, I took an extra long shower. As I was scrubbing my hair clean, my head went quiet. I could feel the water touching my skin, but it made no sound. Through the door, I could still hear the bird singing his heart out. You'd be surprised how cold warm water can feel when you've got ice in your veins. I rinsed off most of the shampoo and stepped out. There's a small, frosted glass window in my bathroom. The silhouette of a pale face was pressed against it. I screamed, but no sound came out. Tugboat kept singing in the other room, unaware. I grabbed my robe and ran into the kitchen to call Patrick, but I couldn't hear anyone pick up on the other end of the line. I couldn't hear my own words when I spoke, and there, just outside the kitchen window, was the silhouette of an intruder trying to find their way in. A pair of unevenly sized eyes stared at me, slightly too far apart. As our eyes met, she bolted, probably heading for the back door. I picked up my keychain. Tugboat stopped singing from the other room as he sensed something was wrong. As my hearing returned, I could hear the comforting sound of a sharp metal from my kitchen knife as I pulled it from a drawer. My pulse was running away from me. It was one thing to think of a home invasion, but to live it violates every thought of privacy and safety you have. It was turning real, fast. There was a large sliding glass door leading out to the backyard, and I figured if there ever came an intruder, it'd be through there. The same room where Tugboat chirped away, but now he'd gone quiet. I ran in there, still fresh out of the shower, my knife held in a cramped, forced grip. I almost convinced myself that I was ready to use it. There she was, just outside the door, pale with unkempt hair, eyes of different sizes, slightly too far apart, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown. She was malnourished and frail, but something told me she had the strength of a madwoman. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching for something. As they landed on me, she opened a wide mouth to scream. Not a sound came out. As her mouth grew to an unnatural size, I could feel vibrations in the air, like standing next to a concert loudspeaker. The sliding glass door shattered, the shards fanning out towards me. The knife in my hand started shaking, but I managed to hold it. She stepped inside, her bare feet smearing ribbons of blood on the hardwood floor. She was coming for me, a constant vibration from an unnatural scream tearing through my body. I had to try to call for help and sprinted back into the kitchen. The light bulbs burst overhead, turning the room black. Still, not a single noise. A stray light from the streets outside made its way through the kitchen window, making the room drip with long, pale shadows. My aunt's collective plates rattled on the wall. Glasses along the kitchen sink were cracking and breaking. Empty bottles spilled onto the floor. Cabinet doors shaking back and forth, opening seemingly at random. An old recipe book fell from a countertop, the pages flicking back and forth. I pressed myself against the kitchen window, fumbling to get it open. She cornered me. Her mouth was wide open in that impossible scream, her body vibrating with machine-like intensity, the tangled head twisting and stretching, as if thrown about in a storm of its own, her uneven eyes searching for me, twitching like insects. And still, she didn't make a single sound. There was no humming fans, no buzzing electricity, only a soft breeze outside the window. I couldn't even hear my heartbeat. I managed to stumble out of the kitchen window, stepping onto the sharp gravel path. I still held onto my knife like a comfort blanket. I didn't even bother to see if she followed me. I just ran. There was no time to get in the car. I ran into the woods, following a trail that would lead me to my neighbor. Soon, the rhythmic beat of my feet went quiet, my breath too. I tried to scream for help, but the sound was swallowed. She was right behind me. Long nails reached for me, fingertips touching the edge of my robe, and all around me, nothing but tranquil nature, unbothered by my terror. I was knocked to the ground, scraping my legs against the undergrowth. I slashed with my knife, trying to fight her, as a dainty hand picked up my keys from the side pocket of my robe. I rolled away, only to see the mess of tangled hair walk away. Her uneven eyes gave me a last look as she turned her back to me. She looked right through me, without a care in the world. I got to my neighbor. My dirty feet muddied their floor, and by the time the police came, it felt like a walking nightmare. I made my statement, showered for the second time that night, and slept at a nearby motel as the police cleared my house. The next day, I assessed the damage. The house had been searched thoroughly, but nothing was stolen. Not too much was broken either. Seems she was looking for something specific, not trying to steal any valuables. The police were just as dumbfounded as I was, and I didn't report anything stolen. My insurance company would need an explanation though. It was hard to explain why it looked like the house had been hit by a tornado from the inside without sounding insane. All the collective plates laid shattered on the floor. Poor Tugboat was so traumatized, he's since stopped singing. Going through the damages was heartbreaking, but it made me take notice of something peculiar. The garage had been searched as well. It was pretty much fine though, at least compared to the house. Among my boxes, I noticed a single item missing. The creepy plate I'd put aside from my aunt, the only one I didn't want in the house. The one with the young cartoon girl feeding the giant frog. It was gone. I guess I found the single collector who wanted it. I recently landed a job at a local fast food restaurant. I, of course, did not want to work, but my mum kept insisting and nagging me to get off my ass and make a living. I live in a small town in Australia, and I'm surrounded by dense bush. This fast food restaurant is very similar to McDonald's, as in, it is a drive-through and sells burgers. This particular restaurant has a bit of history to it, due to the local community not wanting it built, for it being on some old site that the town held dear. I wasn't sure what was there, because I'd recently moved to the area, but all the signs and protests were still carrying on, even though it had been 4 years since the store had opened. After I started working, I was promptly trained in all the major areas, serving customers, running the drive-thru, flipping the patties, and making a damn fine cup of coffee. I got along with most of my co-workers, and got a date with one of the cute ones. After working for around a month, my store manager approached me and asked me if I was interested in working the night shift, the most boring time of the night. where the store would be closed except for drive-through, and I would have to solo the store all night due to it not being a very busy establishment. I graciously accepted, as I sort of needed the money to go out with friends and all that, so I was rostered to be put onto the night shift the following week. Last night. Like any sane person, I slept before my shift. I had something to eat and a shower before donning the work clothing I had to wear for the next 9 hours. I hopped into my car and drove the 10 minutes to my workplace and finally got out and stepped inside. The closing staff greeted me before I jotted down my tasks and started getting to work. The list was the following: make the dining area spotless, mop the floor,